we are so simplistically minded that we can only think of, one thing in, one thing out, one thing in, one thing out. We have this linear approach to the world. The nature is it's fractal, it's chaotic in its simplest form. So no matter where you look, you have this idea that you have to look at a whole. You have to adapt. You can't simply mitigate by taking. Okay, we're gonna stop cows farting. No more cowing, no more cattle ranching.
Hello and welcome to the Regenerative Design Podcast. I'm your host, Mathieu Mehuis, and in this show, I interview the leading authorities in the world of regenerative practices, people who do good and do well. Are you a person that cares about your environment and our planet? Are you a person that wants to leave the planet to our children to be something that we can be truly proud of? Something to enjoy for many generations to come. But are you also a person that believes we can do all of this and do good in business? Well, I have really good news for you. You're here listening to the podcast that is all about making our planet a better place and making your business more successful. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Regenerative Design Podcast. Today we have another amazing guest. His name is Bert, terHart. I could actually say it in Dutch because it sounds like Bert, terHart, I would say in my language. But Bert is not from the Netherlands. He's actually from Canada, British Columbia. And Bert is a SEO and SEM strategist. So that's all about search engine optimization. He has a business in that field. He also is the founder and CEO of Next Generation SEO. That's all about that business. And Lead Brain AI, and I'm actually excited to talk a little bit about that as well. But more importantly, and that's why we actually connected, is that Bert is a sailor and a real adventurer. So you might be thinking, like, what does this have to do with regenerative design? But we'll get to that. First of all, Bert, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. I'm so excited to speak with you again today. I've been looking forward to this conversation actually for a bit. So I couldn't be more pleased to be here. And I'm so excited to get going. And I don't have no idea where we're going to end up because we could be anywhere. But so
yes, I love that. It's really like an adventure. Like that. I think that's a passion that we share. I love traveling the world. It's just going to new places, doing like extreme sports, or like I love surfing. I love being in the ocean. I started sailing a few years ago, and I just completely fell in love with it. And you're a big sailor, so just tell me from a backstory, where did all of this adventure start, and actually how did you end up starting your business? I'm curious about that.
Well, I think sailing and salt water has been in my blood for a very long time, if not from the very beginning. My father actually, well, my parents are Dutch, as you know, my name is Dutch, of course. My parents are Dutch. They immigrated to Canada in 52 for my father and 56 for my mom when they got married. But my father rowed and sailed to school. So his father was in the Dutch Merchant Marine. His grandfather was in the Dutch Merchant Marine. The same thing on my mother's side of the family. So they were all sailors. And my father ended up in Canada because he had navigational skills, which translates.
Wait, just one step back. How did he sail to school every day? How does that work?
He lived on an island.
That was in the Netherlands.
Yeah, he lived on an island in the middle of the Amsterdam harbor. That island now is I think is now nothing but giant apartment buildings. But at the time, it was that island was owned by the ship's company that his father worked for, and my grandfather was a ship's engineer, the chief engineer for SMN, which is the line that my father sailed with, and his father, of course. So he was
SMN. What is that?
I couldn't say it. It's the Nederlands.
Scheepvaartmaatschappij Nederland.
Yeah, there you go.
Steam engine. Boat company. Wow.
Yes. So
It is so interesting because I didn't even know that. Just before your interview, I interviewed, and this episode will come out before this episode, an entrepreneur from Belgium who has a company that they're building huge ships, CMB Tech, and they're actually, the reason why I interviewed Alexander Saveries is his name, is because they're building ships on hydrogen.
Oh, really?
So that's really interesting to they're on a mission to change the the transportation system on boats by going into hydrogen.
Well, that's actually, I mean, we may talk about this, but at any one time there's 60,000 ships at sea, 60,000 container ships at sea, which is a massive number, and they all run on the lowest quality diesel fuel that you can imagine, and they are the worst polluters, the worst atmospheric polluters in the world by at least an order of magnitude. So solving that problem is a very big deal. It's a very, very big deal in terms of how we're impacting the environment, given our given the current state of transportation. It's way worse than cars, and you wouldn't think of it, right? It's way worse than cars.
No, it's interesting. I launched it. I told you the story that I launched my book. Kind of crazy story. I launched my book on a cruise ship from Vancouver to Alaska. I thought in my life I would never be on a cruise ship, but it was organized by the publisher. There was a whole networking event. So I said, okay, let's do it. And I decided to publish my book on that trip.
Yeah.
So my book was actually published in international waters, which is also, I like that way. It's not really binded to a place. It's for the whole world. But then we did also a tour of the whole machine rooms and all this stuff. And it was fascinating how polluting it was. It was like using 1,000 liters of oil per week per person on that ship. It's like it's without, like, it's hard to grasp that. And interestingly, when we went from Vancouver to Alaska, when it was getting into Alaska waters, they had to switch the fuel. They couldn't use that polluting fuel. They had to use like a more cleaner energy.
Correct. Yeah, it's shocking. And one of what's interesting about that, I mean, we can talk about this, but there has always been wide discrepancies in labor for ever since man started making things. So you'd go, from A to B, or country A to B, or region A to B. There was discrepancies in labor. Some was cheaper, some was more expensive.
And discrepancies mean like inconsistencies or like
differences.
Different.
It just means differences. So there was differences in labor costs and obviously difference in skills. And of course that's true today. But one of the only way that we can take advantage of those discrepancies in labor is the fact that we can transport things so unbelievably cheaply around the world. Complements of 60,000 container ships at sea. So before, I mean, if you think of it, if the British Empire would have to they would have to sail around the world via Cape Horn to go to a different market or to take advantage of a different skill set. So think of silk, for example. I think how expensive that was to put someone on a ship and send them around the world and come back, or tea. Everyone knows, the tea clippers and the tea races. But we do that now for next to nothing. Like, you can order stuff from China and you'll pay $1 for shipping, and it comes over in a giant freighter. Think of that. If you stop and think about that for a minute, it's not one of the things that completely and utterly enables our lifestyle is the fact that transportation costs are so unbelievably cheap and so incredibly sophisticated, and they work so unbelievably well, and no one is willing to give up on it, which is one of the reasons why 60,000 ships at sea, the worst atmospheric polluters on the planet by at least an order of magnitude, everyone turns a blind eye to that.
No, at the expense of marine wildlife, at the expense of the oceans being polluted. Yeah.
So it's I mean, it's one of those problems that's staring you square in the face. But I mean, and look, if we can expand this out a bit, not talking about something simple, let's talk about Canada in particular. And one of my bugaboos, one of the things I don't like, one of the things that bothers me, is really bad policy around really important things. So Canada, for example, has been saying all these great things about their commitment to climate change and battling the issues that are facing us. And of course, we're not doing anything about it because we have these incredibly poor policies that sound good but do no good whatsoever. So Canada has not met any of its climate change goals, any of its carbon emitting goals ever since. And we signed on to the Kyoto Accord, Paris Accords, you name it. We're all on board, but we know that the policy as such isn't going to make any difference whatsoever. So there's no reason to engage in something that's not going to make any difference. But if you sound good, that means you get votes. I mean, this is a very cynical view of how this works, but that's exactly how that works. I mean, I'm I was trained academically. I was trained formally as a scientist, so I know whereof I speak in this regard. I've actually read the IPOs. I was the best man at one of the Nobel-winning scientists on the first intergovernmental panel on climate change. His name is Dr. Andrew Weaver. He's
Wow.
a he's an oceanographer and a climate scientist, now retired at the University of Victoria. But my point is that I is as a scientist, you don't have the luxury of poor policy, because
No.
poor policy would be the equivalent of a very bad hypothesis or a poor theory. It's just not gonna get you anywhere. As a
No.
sailor, you don't have the luxury of poor policy, because you're so completely embedded in the natural world
No.
that and in reality, that if you decide to fly in the face of reality, which is in my definition or one of them of a poor policy, then pretty soon you're going to end up with some sort of catastrophic consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, terminal. I mean, if you're in a small boat at sea, if you're
Which
not,
we are seeing today, yeah, big
yeah.
storms. It's become.
So you have to be plugged into really good policy, and so yeah. Anyway, we could. I don't really want to get going on that, but
No, I think we can. Let's just frame it like we know what the problem statement is.
yeah, that's a good way to look
We
at it.
want policies to improve. We
Correct.
not necessarily can change that in our power. There's some exciting things are happening in policies. Like if you look at if we also put our focus away from the bad news, there's actually a ton of really good
Yes,
news. Like
of course.
just to give an example, the Azores, where I'm going to be moving, and they just assigned one of the biggest marine protected areas in the world. So, which is great. So they limit the fishing, or they will like organize it so it's sustainable, ecological, regenerative in that sense. So I think there's a lot of movement, maybe too slow, but that's all we can do. And I think when everybody, instead of waiting for policies to change, when you can
Correct.
change something in your own life, that's gonna have a way bigger impact than you can imagine. So that's where I want to get to your work. But maybe just before we go there, I think we're still missing a bit of the backstory. So your father was always in sailing, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
so you were brought up with that from an early age, I
Yeah,
feel
yeah.
like. So you got
Yeah,
into some adventures from an early age.
Oh yeah. So I grew up in the prairies. So in the middle of Canada, as far from every one of the oceans as you can get. So as far from the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Arctic as you could get. But my dad, being a sailor, we always had a small boat. There's lots of, there's lakes and rivers. So we were always, trying to get to a river, or getting on a lake and going sailing or rowing or canoeing or something. And just living in those environments is an adventure in and of itself. It's not easy. It's very difficult to make. It's a harsh environment. Of course, it's hard to make a living. My dad was a surveyor, so he was always outside. So I helped my dad. I worked with my dad when I was a kid, so we were always outside.
Wow.
Even getting to Canada was an adventure. So my mom, to give you some idea of this, is sort of in my blood. My mom was secretary to the Dutch ambassador to France. So she was living in Paris, and my dad was surveying in northern Canada. He saved up. He left the ship's company. He stopped. Was no longer a mariner. Came to Canada. You need to have a job to come to Canada. His job was to paint a house. So he got that job. Compliments to his father in Regina, Saskatchewan, in the middle of nowhere, as far away from the ocean as you could get. But that's the only place he could get a job. So he got that job. He had navigational skills, which are the equivalent of survey skills. So he got hired as a surveyor basically within a week, and they sent him up to northern Canada, like just in the middle, literally the middle of nowhere, to survey what is now a uranium mine.
So it was mostly to find resources, or
so he was surveying basically the town site. So they were going to build a mine, and Dad was surveying it with a bunch of other people, of course.
Yeah, sure.
Saved up all his money for 2 years, and he flew back to Paris and asked my mom to marry him. And my mom is in Paris working and she's working with the Dutch Foreign Service. At the time, she'd worked in Canberra. She'd worked in Paris, of course. She'd worked in Amsterdam. She worked in Ottawa. So she was a very cosmopolitan woman. She spoke 5 languages, highly educated, all these things. My dad shows up, says, "Will you marry me?" My mom, for some crazy reason, says yes. And she goes from Paris Paris
From a
to
stable, good life with full of opportunities.
she
Or
ends up in a little town in northern Saskatchewan, right on the close to the border, actually called the Paw, and
fascinating.
it's living in a trailer that my dad had made. A 10 foot wide, 10 foot long, basically a 10 foot wide trailer by my maybe 12 feet long. My dad had pounded together with sheets of plywood. So there's a spirit of adventure. I think I come by it naturally. And whenever my father used to give me a bad time, we would look at him and say, well, I learned it from you. And then that would sort of put an end to the conversation. Well, he would always say, well, it was different. It was different. So
Right.
I ended up, I wanted to be in the Navy, I wanted to be a mariner like my father. And the only place I could get an undergraduate oceanography degree, which is what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an oceanographic. I wanted to be a physical oceanographer, someone who studied waves in the ocean. The only place to do that and to start on that path was in military college. So I did that, wanting to be a naval officer, but I'm completely colorblind. I basically see the world in grayscale.
What?
So you can't, you're not supposed to be on a ship. So I'm in military college thinking I'm going to be in the Navy, thinking I have my whole life is laid out before me, right? And they get to me and they say, okay, terHart, you can't be in the Navy. We got bad news for you. And I go, okay. Well, and the good news is, you've got a couple of choices. Okay, what are they? It's like, okay, terHart, you can be in the Army or you can be in the Army. Well, what do you want to do? so okay, well, I'll be in the Army. So I decided to take a more difficult path, a more adventuresome path. Ended up in the Special Service Force, jumping out of airplanes, dressed like a bush.
What?
And then as soon as I finished my time, I went back to graduate school to become an oceanic scientist.
Wow.
I graduate with my fancy degrees and get a job. And the Canadian government decides right at that time that they're going to stop they're going to stop funding shipboard research, which means I'm not going to get on a ship to do any
So
oceanography.
that's everything you had studied for and worked for.
So I could be an oceanographer, but I'm going to be sitting at a desk, writing computer code, which I thought would be really boring. I didn't want to do that.
No.
So a friend of mine at the time said, hey, I'm starting this very large medical clinic and I want to automate it. I want to automate everything because there's just way too many problems because the type of medicine he was doing, it was just fraught with human error because it was nothing but very complicated calculations, very difficult patient management routines. And he didn't want to leave that up to humans. He said, okay, we can, computers were just coming online. And he knew I had programming skills. So he said, can you write this code? I said, I think I can. So I did that. We ended up in California with a very large medical clinic. It was like 63,000 square feet or something like this. And I wrote all the code. Me and another guy wrote all the code for that.
Oh.
And then ended up selling that, using that code to leverage into other medical practices. So at one time, I had 2,500 doctors, Canada, the United States, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, all using using this patient management differential diagnostic code that I'd written. And the other partner ended up starting Pandel, which is a huge software company here in Canada. Anyway, so I fell into computer programming.
Oh wow!
And then because it was right at the start of Google and all the insanity that the internet turned into, I fell into that whole space. So basically, we learned very quickly on that to get any traction whatsoever in this world, you had to get found online. And of course, that's meant different things, over the era. If you can use that for an internet, if it's only gone an era that lasts like 20 years.
Yeah.
So, and I fell into that space, just getting found online. So that's how I ended up with Next Gen SEO. Ended up with LeadBrain. Ended up doing this thing. So that's sort of been the journey. But the thread that's runs through all that is, I seem to find and gravitate towards things that are hard. and there's an interesting philosophical discussion you can have about that. We talked about that a little bit earlier about soaring music in cathedrals. Yes. And I think we have a moral imperative to do the things that are hard. And I think that's
building a huge church and putting an organ in place and building the architecture for the sound. It's a really hard job.
It's a very hard job. And that's completely scale invariant. So no matter how small you break that task up into,
Mm.
then it's still that this moral imperative drives through that entire spectrum of scale.
Mm.
It extends from one end of the scale to the other. So I think that which again speaks to being an adventurer, doing these things that people might consider to be crazy hard,
Yep.
but in point of fact, people have been doing them for millennia before me. People have been sailing for a very long time. People have been sailing around the world, obviously in different contexts. But at the time that people were doing it was incredibly difficult. Think of Magellan. Think of the first person. Well, he never quite made it, but the first crew to do it. How unbelievably difficult that was. But that was
Mm.
true of sailing anywhere. Think of just. I mean, I meant to kind of put a point on this. I grew up in Saskatchewan, like I said, that people have been living in that place for 5,000 years. The oldest thing I have in the house is about 4,000 years old. Actually, it's a spear point that I found in a creek bed.
Wow.
Been people living there for a very long time, but suddenly at some point in their in that during that time frame when people were living there, obsidian showed up. Obsidian was a far superior material for making arrowheads because they were very sharp, they were long lasting, easy to work. But obsidian is not part of, you don't find obsidian. The closest obsidian is basically 1,200 or 1,500 miles away. So how does obsidian get to Canada to a place where I am from 1,000 miles away? It's a trade route. It got there through trade, people walking and doing all the things that
Mm.
you and I do when we go to the grocery store, except we do it in a very collapsed time frame. So this idea of first adventuring, like getting obsidian from one place to the next, and entrepreneurship, getting
Mm.
obsidian from, because that's a business, right? There's some value there that's being
Yes.
exchanged.
I
So
love
these
this about
things,
the fact that you help people to be found online because, like you said, it's essential and it's something that I'm going to be focusing on the year that's coming, 2025,
mhm,
is how can I reach more people through online search engine optimization, all the work you're doing. So I
mhm,
think it's even with I never thought about this, but in the realm of like, okay, how can we make an impact in the world, change, do the work that I'm doing, like creating regenerative gardens, helping farmers to be more regenerative. When we can use the technologies and the knowledge that you have to reach more people, I think it can have a huge, fast ripple effect.
yeah,
So I think
yeah,
we should talk offline about that as well.
yeah.
After we
I
work
mean,
on that.
what's interesting about I'll say one thing about that: the difference between an explorer and an adventurer. An explorer writes about his experiences, and an adventurer just goes searching for experiences, and they end with him or her.
Hmm.
So, and that's a it's a
Big
backhanded
difference.
way of saying that your story is the most important piece of intellectual property. It's the most valuable currency that you have moving
Mm.
forward. And one of the things that social media says is that your stories, because social media is all about an individual story, has unbelievable traction, a traction
Mm.
that you cannot possibly imagine. And because it's our story, because we live it, we tend to think it's not important because, oh, it's just me. I've just, what does it matter? But that's entirely the wrong. I mean, that's a perspective that's unbelievably limiting.
Mm.
And um,
I love
the
how you corrected yourself that it is a true perspective but it's a limiting one.
yeah, yeah. So you have an amazing story. I mean, I know that you have an unbelievable story, and if you could, if you lean into that story, the amount of traction that you would get, like that. What I mean by traction is the amount of of interest, how people are drawn to you, and how they manage to stick to you, like glue or Velcro is what I'm calling traction.
Mm.
And that is that's completely and totally a function of your story. So let's think of Nike. Nike spent millions and millions and millions of dollars advertising. And when they first started, you would have no idea that they made shoes because their stories were all about um, athletes and athletes performing at their best. Michael Jordan flying through the air, all these things. They were not, so their story was not about building shoes. It was all about how can we pursue and how can we celebrate athletic excellence. That's their story.
It's result oriented. Like, what's the
Yes.
outcome of the good shoe? It's to
Yeah.
perform at the highest level, not
Yes.
to
Yeah.
have a
And that,
nice looking shoe.
so they would just lean into that. They would lean into that story. And of course, it has to be genuine. Otherwise it goes wildly wrong.
Oh yeah.
And a good example of it going wildly wrong would be the Jaguar ad that came out just recently.
Which one now? What's happened?
Oh,
I remember Jaguar had a good one before, where they kind of dissed Mercedes or BMW came out with an ad where were holding like chicken, and if you hold a chicken like and you move it around, then the head stays stable. So they use that to show like they have a new technology that cars are more stable.
Yeah,
and then Jaguar made the same advertisement, like faking these, or like looking at how these Mercedes scientists in white clothes were holding the chicken, like,
yeah,
and then there's a big Jaguar that just eats the chicken, and that was a good one. But what happened with the recent one?
Well, Jaguar had an ad that had nothing to do with cars, and it said nothing about their story. It was just this. It was they were just simply. If you Google it, I forget what it would be exactly, but I mean, if you look at you see it. Elon Musk, tweeted that.
And destroyed them probably.
Yeah. Do you make cars? So,
hilarious.
So anyway, it wasn't. It didn't resonate with their customers. Didn't get any traction. It was just like, what are you guys talking about? What is this?
It's no longer the Jaguar because it was absorbed by a Chinese group, I think.
Yeah. So I think that again, this idea of storytelling has how it can be transformative in terms of entrepreneurship and in terms of how the world perceives not just you but something new. So and what people will find interesting. I know this for a fact. If with you in particular, you will tell your story or some aspect of it or something that resonates deeply in you with your story, and someone will take that in, process it internally, and then they'll reflect it back at you in a way that you won't recognize. But it's a different perspective on your story that then affords you a deeper, more profound understanding of your own journey and your own perspective, and how you are then relating, how you are sort of reaching out in the world. So instead of doing this in an ignorant, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, in an ignorant fashion, which is I don't know how I'm actually reaching or touching or resonating with people, you'll be able to see these reflections and then have a deeper, more profound understanding of how it is you're actually communicating with not just your customers, of course, but with your audience in general. And I think that's incredibly valuable. Do
you have certain systems for that, or is that generally you mean how that social media can like explode overnight, even with
there's
most social media, but like TikTok, if you make something that catches fire, you don't even need any followers or anything. When it catches fire, it can explode overnight.
If people knew how to make viral content programmatically, then there would be no such thing as viral content, right? So
everybody would go viral, and then it's useless.
Yeah, exactly. So there's no programmatic way to do it. The only sure way to do it is to this sounds cliche, is to be real, is to be genuine.
Yeah, it's true. I've
and if you do that, you will not appeal to everyone, and you don't want to appeal to everyone. You only want to. I've
had that crazy. I'm going to tell you a story just to jump into it. Sure. I posted a story of my company's name, Paulonia, of a tree. So my company is named after a tree, which has a lot of really cool properties it's really good for climate change. It grows really fast. It produces huge leaves. So and the crazy story is that I was even doubting if anybody would be interested in that story. So just me standing next to that tree with even maybe that help, but there's a little girl in the video that's holding a measurement stick just to show how big the tree grows in one season. It's a friend's daughter, and that video in like a week or maybe over 2 weeks, it got 200,000 views on Instagram, which is like, it's already harder on Instagram than on TikTok, or I don't know. So 200,000 views, and a lot of people were also reacting about negatively about that this tree might be invasive, or and it might be invasive in some species in some areas of the world. But it's crazy how when you create something that not everybody likes, it actually adds up to the fire of it. And that's probably why so much bad news or why certain things spread so easily.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head in a very particular way, in that if your message is not polarizing, it's the wrong message. So you need to, if your message is polarizing, it means that you are energizing the people that you want to talk to.
Yeah,
right?
They get better about it.
They get better, and they want more from you. And the people that you will never connect with anyway, then you go, okay, those people they're just not my audience.
They get triggered actually, maybe, and I, to all these people that say like, oh, this plant is invasive and bad, I all responded to them like, well, it's you can also find other plant. Like, I hope that they maybe like reconsidered it, because there's another brilliant book that's called How Invasive Species Are Gonna Save Our Planet. And it talks about like, okay, what are invasive species? They grow really well, and they haven't grown good in or they're not from that specific condition or that area of the world. But with climate change, the climate is changing anyways. And a lot of these invasive species, they now find that they are actually improving the soil. Like in Belgium, we have one invasive species, and it is a bit of a difficult plant because it can even destroy concrete. But what it also does is that it can restore polluted soils. So it's a brilliant plant in that sense, because in Belgium we have over hundreds of years we had a lot of chemical industries, and it's a fairly small country with a lot of harbor and a lot of chemical companies. So and even on the highway we have the oil of the cars and all this stuff. That's where these plants are thriving, and they're actually restoring the health of the soil. So I'm fascinated about the perspective of maybe, okay, we have to be considerate about using invasive plants, but maybe they also are here to fulfill a certain prophecy in terms of like restoring the soil.
Well, I think that, I mean, every plant species that you see is invasive, because it came from somewhere to land here. So
exactly.
But the difference, the difference now is that the timescales have been so incredibly collapsed. So things happen at a pace that's at an unprecedented pace. So we have a problem keeping up, right? But like you said, the Earth, maybe not so much.
No, that's it. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective that I also considered. Like, Mother Earth is going to be fine. Like, it's with the climate change, and I see it like it's an organism that's kind of in a fever. So when you have fever, you have temperature swings, which is now we see it like even in Belgium. It's winter here, we have extreme cold, and all of a sudden super warm again. So that's kind of I think the Earth is an organism in and of itself. We're part of it, but it's trying to, like, when it's in a fever situation, it tries to get rid of organisms that are not necessarily helping it.
Yeah,
that's how an organism functions. So we can decide, like, keep destroying the planet, and then it becomes very hard for us to live on this planet. Or we can change the direction of the wind and work, not change the direction of the wind, change the direction of our sails, and go with the wind of how nature works.
Okay, you make an interesting point, and we had talked briefly about good and bad policy, and humans are very, very good at adaptation.
Yep.
Like your analogy was, okay, we'll just trim the sails a bit and head off in a slightly different direction. We are terrible at mitigating. We have a track record that extends for thousands of years across every single culture at trying to mitigate things.
Change. Yeah.
So things like mitigation would be trying to control the amount of sunlight hitting the Earth. One of Bill Gates's.
That's a brilliant perspective. I never thought of it, that you now even saying that historically we have a hard time mitigating it. And all
Correct.
the efforts that we are doing today around climate change, whether you like them or not, it's about mitigation.
Yeah,
It's about, okay, how can we reduce
yeah,
greenhouse gas emissions? How can we find a new technology that can create more oxygen? Well,
yeah,
try trees, maybe they're really good at it. Or other plants, photosynthesis is like
yeah,
the
yeah,
best
yeah.
technology out there. So we're trying to mitigate it, and it
Yes.
doesn't work. And that's the
No,
part of what regenerative design is. It's not about sustainability, because if you look at sustainability, it means to sustain. It's just to continue a little bit how we do it and reduce the bad sides. But if we completely change it, and it's so possible. I see it in the garden designs that we do. I see it with the farmers that we work with. When we change the way, like, okay, we're gonna do it a little bit less bad, changing it to no, we're just gonna make it so much better to what we're doing today. Like I've just interviewed other people in the podcast about biochar, other technologies that are based on how nature works, and the results are incredible. You're
yeah,
trying to solve one problem,
yeah,
and out of the blue you're also solving
correct.
10 other problems.
Yeah,
And that's how
yeah,
nature works. And
yeah.
you surf that wave. It's like we can reverse climate change
Well,
like so easily. Like even with farming, regenerative farming, if half of the farmers change to that, or when for half of the charm, I'm going to say when, not if, when half of the farmers change to regenerative farming, we can go to pre-industrial revolutions amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 7 years. Technically, that means we can reverse climate change in 7 years. And it's actually going to benefit the farmers because they produce higher quality food. They'll get better pay for it. The benefits are so good
yeah,
that you can't even we can't continue that those farmers that are not going to change. It becomes impossible for them to farm because of, well, in Europe, the legacy, the policies are changing. And again, whether or not you agree with them, they're not that good actually, but at least there's a direction that we're getting into. But mostly it's climate change itself. Like you can't keep doing it the way we've been doing it for the last 50 to 100 years.
yeah. I
It
mean,
won't work anymore. It's falling
yeah,
apart.
yeah. It's. I mean, it's if you actually look at the science, there, it would back up exactly what you said. And of course, what you hear today constantly are people who are making policy, who are poor policy, are simply cherry picking the science, taking it out of context, and then spinning it up as some sort of, and just trying to
Yeah, then
drive.
we end up with these things like cow
Yeah.
farts are bad for the
Yes. I mean,
environment. Like
what one of my favorite examples of people, I'm sure people to really put a stamp on this. So my parents are Dutch, right? Most of Holland is under sea level, is below sea level, right?
yeah.
So imagine, there's a bunch of Dutch people looking at, they're on the Afsluit dike and they're looking and the sea levels are rising. What do you think the Dutch will do? Do you think they'll just throw their hands up in defeat and throw themselves in the ocean? Or do you think they'll adapt by making the dike a little bit higher rather
Yes.
than trying to, put giant electric elements into the ocean and then evaporate enough water to lower sea level? I mean, there's an example of mitigation, right, that I just made up. Of course, it's completely ridiculous. No more ridiculous than the lady who decided that every mariner should memorize a million star patterns, right? We talked about that.
Yes.
So, but the Dutch are simply going to mitigate. They're simply going to adapt by the dike will go higher, and then we'll adapt by building a higher dike. The same thing in the Mekong Delta. There's 130 million people now living below sea level in the Mekong Delta, and that's projected to be 180 million. Well, do you think the 50 million are just going to throw themselves into the ocean? No, they'll adapt by, because they've adapted now. So my point is simply that we're very good at adapting, which is what you've been describing. And on the local level, anytime, and this is what you can do. This is one of my goals, is to get people to engage locally with good policy and to be vociferous, and which is to say raise their voices against policy that is just stupid.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be a rocket scientist. We all know what good policy looks like, and we all know what bad policy looks like. And we've just been we've the backlash on typically the backlash, whatever form that comes, can be so severe because the people who are promoting these, I'll say, bad ideas, They the only way that you can make a bad idea move forward is by force. I have to literally jam it down your throat because it
Mm.
can't stand on its own merits. So yeah, I'm and I think you can do. I think you can. Whether as a citizen scientist, something that we can talk about. I think that you can make a real impact locally.
Yes.
I think that you can, you can engage with really good policy. You can support really good policy
Yes.
locally, and
And I
that,
think, yeah.
and what you had said other was really interesting as well because nature is this incredibly complex organism. That's a good way to look at it. There's many variables that go into a single outcome. So
Mm.
it's not just I do this one thing and this one thing comes out
No.
because there's you say like you said we make this one change and suddenly there's all these other benefits that we had
Yeah.
no idea that we're gonna be a result
Yeah.
of that one change. That's because there's many things, many things going into the equation, and
Yes.
there's many things that that can come out.
Mm.
And if you tend to put good things in, good things tend to come out.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at same. And on the other hand, when we isolate things like our planet is, like you said, an incredible complex organism, and then we have certain problems on that organism, like climate change, and
Mhm.
then we start to isolate these problems, and then all of a sudden we start to look at farming, and we look at what emissions. Okay, cows are farting, and it's actually true. Like it's not that it's a lie that cows are actually producing methane.
Mhm.
But what they're forgetting is that when a cow is working as a cow as it should be, it's a grazing animal, and it gets mostly on pasture land, which, by the way, pasture land, a lot of cows can be grazed on land that is unusable for
Mhm.
agriculture or even nature restoration. It can't be done, or even combine it, because they've seen also a lot that nature reserves, where they started to like fence off certain areas and remove all the impact, that ecosystem also collapsed,
Mhm.
because grazing animals are an essential part of an ecosystem.
Mhm.
Now, okay, because we've like hunted a lot of the wild animals in a lot of places in the world, we can't put them back yet. And then the one of the few animals that can help do that, and that's been like even on our family farm, we have cattle that is grazing on nature reserve, because it enhances the natural value of that nature reserve, because the
Mhm.
cows graze, they obviously have the bullshit literally that comes out, and that attracts insects, and that attracts birds to feed from the insects, and there's a whole ecosystem that comes from that. But then if you that is a complex system which we're only starting to understand now, and it's important to try and understand it even if it's extremely complex. Same with the soil life, it's extremely complex, but we're starting to understand there's so much symbiosis happening.
Mhm.
And then, but if you then isolate a cow as a methane producing unit, it's true,
Mhm.
but we forget that when it's grazing as a grazing animal, it's actually enhancing photosynthesis, because the cow grazes the grasslands, and that stimulates plant
Mhm.
growth,
Mhm.
and that enhances the photosynthesis, because it grows and it regrows, and the cow dung actually improves the soil health. So then the methane, even if you're emitting methane, it will draw back more carbon dioxide, methane, and other atmospheric gases into, because the grassland is functioning better.
Mhm.
So that's in a net. If you do grazing with cattle, it's carbon negative, so it can actually produce carbon negative meat, and
Mhm.
that's something we've been focusing on, and I'm very hopeful about that. And then the quality, and then as a small side benefit, that you get the quality of the meat that you eat is full of like minerals and
Mhm.
extremely rich in
Yeah.
healthy fats that we need, that not everybody might need, but at least some people that are drawn to eating more of a meat uh, diet, not even fully meat, that improves their health as well.
Mhm.
So I think looking at it holistically is a very important part of the equation.
I'll say, in to just to back up completely what you say in a different context is that here on the West Coast, we rely very heavily on the salmon fishery, right? Which is this sort of this fish come back every year, different
Hmm.
cycles, of course. But um, there was in one particular year, there was a complete collapse of the sockeye salmon fishery. And that was caused by a landslide in the Fraser River that basically shut off the return of millions upon millions upon millions of sockeye salmon up into the tributaries of the Fraser. That
Oh.
resulted in a complete collapse of the ecosystems on these smaller tributaries because there was hundreds of thousands of tons of biomass, which is
Mm.
basically fertilizer that was no longer going into the system. Fertilizer in the form of dead salmon because they go upstream, die, and then lay in the riverbed.
And
Which means
apparently, I heard also that the bear that eat that
correct.
they
It's
poop
exactly
in the forest and they're
correct.
important for the plants to grow. It's
Correct.
crazy. It's
Yes,
a whole nutrient cycle.
exactly, and it's exactly the same thing that you described in a slightly different context. So this idea of a very complex system, so that when you take one thing out, it's not just that one thing that you're affecting. It's the entire
Oh,
body, right? It's the entire organism, and we are so simplistically minded that we can
mhm.
only think of one thing in, one thing out, one thing in,
Yes,
one thing out. We have this linear approach to the world. The
yes.
nature is it's fractal, it's chaotic in
Hmm.
its simplest form. So no matter where you look, you have this idea that you have to look at a whole. You have to adapt. You can't simply mitigate by taking. It's okay. We're gonna stop cows farting. No more cowing. No
Yeah,
more cattle ranching. It's like that we're going to stop that, and
yes.
that's a mitigation response, right? We're going to
And it
stop.
actually makes the problem worse because
All you've done is make it
especially
worse. Yeah.
in climates of the world where you have limited rainfall,
Hmm.
cattle are, or well, it used to be grazing animals like in Africa on the Great Plains. You have all the different grazing animals. They're actually sustaining or regenerating that ecosystem. Now take them away, it collapses, and that's what's been happening. That's why we have so many deserts in the world,
Hmm.
and why deserts are increasing it because the lack of the grazing animal that is able to improve the soil health. And yeah, it's a beautiful story, and similar to like people that would say we have to stop or even tax cows or whatever.
Hmm.
Then you should also go and talk to the bears and be like, oh, you should stop eating salmon because you're farting
Yes.
salmon
Yeah.
methane as well.
Yeah. 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 I mean,
Try and do that.
it's absurd in its face. If you take one step back, right? If you want to stop sounding good, right? Because it sounds good. We need to lower we need to lower methane
Yeah.
contributions to the atmosphere. That sounds good, right? But that doesn't do any good, especially considering where we
No,
are right
same
now.
with the war on carbon dioxide. It's a wrong way of thinking, and it's like demonizing something.
Yeah.
And again, I've there's some value in, okay, we have to quantify and like even carbon taxes might be valuable, or carbon accreditation might be also good, carbon sequestration.
Hmm.
But we have to still be aware that carbon dioxide is just part of a cycle.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
now that carbon dioxide levels have increased in the atmosphere, trees are growing faster than ever in history,
Yeah.
or at least in this
Yeah.
recent last couple of million years.
There's a net greening on the world in the world because of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the land mass, the net greening is equivalent to the United States, the land mass of the lower United States, not including Alaska. So that's, I mean, there's, like you say, there's two
Nature is
sides.
robust.
There's two sides, right? So there is an increase in carbon dioxide, of
Hmm.
course, that can have tremendously detrimental impacts, of course.
Yep.
But then let's look at the whole picture, right? It turns out that there's some benefits, so you can't just say, okay, it's bad. We got to do everything
Yeah.
in our power. So again, it's an adaptive response as opposed to a mitigative response.
Yep.
I gave a talk, it was a bit of a keynote thing for the Ocean Cruising Club's 70th anniversary celebrations here on the West Coast. And
Nice.
the talk I gave was climate change, a paddler's perspective, because I had just paddled across Canada and I was going to talk about climate change.
Talk a bit more about that adventure
Okay, so
for, for our
I,
listeners.
I came back from my trip around the world, this solo nonstop circumnavigation, basically, and I was following in the I was
Solo
following.
suck. Can you explain that again?
So I
What?
sailed solo, which is by yourself,
Yes.
nonstop, which means I left and came back to the same place without stopping. and circumnavigation is around the world. So
Oh,
I had to go, which means that you're traveling through the Southern Ocean because you can't go through the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal because
Cape
that,
Horn. You're going through Cape
yeah.
Horn,
So
the most
I left,
dangerous sea ever.
correct. It's the most extreme environment on the planet is the Southern Ocean. So,
How was that? I'm just curious. Were you
uh,
unlucky or was it still
well, you
rough?
have to be lucky. I mean, it's insanely difficult. I mean, to give you some idea of how hard it is. So 6,000 people have been to the top of Everest. 600 people have been in space. 300 people have sailed nonstop around the world. 9 people have done it, sailed nonstop around the world using a sextant, so no electronic navigation at all. I'm the
That's what
ninth
you did.
person, and I'm the first North or South American to do it. So that's a way of.
Only 9 people have done what you've done.
Well, when I finished, I was the ninth. Since that time, there's been a couple of others as
Jesus.
part of the Golden Globe race, but it's insanely difficult because it is a wild part of the world. It's the most extreme environment on the planet, bar none, including Antarctica, including the top of all these crazy places. You
So you
can,
got in some sketchy situation, or from your
oh yeah, of
experience, you were
course.
able to
No, of course you can't help it. I mean, I turned the boat upside down, almost upside down 3 times.
in that sea, or generally
No, during that trip, uh, and because the storms are wild, the storms
in the
are.
Cape Horn as well. You got in some dodgy
Oh yeah, yeah.
situation.
I mean, I went around Cape Horn. I was there January 9th or so, basically at the height of their summer, and I took a massive gamble actually to avoid just getting absolutely crushed by a storm. I ended up in the, I ended, yeah. And anyway, it's the weather is crazy. The weather is something you can't imagine. Well, firstly, the waves are, well, I mean, it's just it's there's no place in the world like it. There's just no place in the world like it. There's no bound basically, because
What do
you're
you
at a
mean by
place.
balance?
There's no landmass in the Southern Ocean. There's no landmass to stop to stop or steer weather, and there's no bounding landmass. There's no bounding weather because weather tends to be bound by topographically,
Hmm.
which is to say that, well, let's kind of leave it at that. I get too crazy, and then
There's
there's
no predictability because of that, or limited
uh,
predictability.
well there's well basically if a like when a hurricane traveling across the Atlantic runs into land, it runs out of steam, right? It literally starts running out of the energy required to sustain and make it grow, because it sucks up heat and moisture from the ocean, which is the driver. So landmass, when it bumps into North America as it travels, from east to west, it's building. It starts on the coast of Africa, builds,
Hmm.
gets to be huge by the time it gets to the Caribbean, and bigger when it gets across the Gulf Stream, because that's a very warm, humid, very warm current. Of course, it's very humid, and then
Yeah.
it bumps into North America, and then suddenly the energy source is just shut off. It's like someone
Wow.
hits the switch, and it gets smaller. And then as it sort of curves up and starts heading north, it loses all that. It loses some of the the energy that's required to maintain and sustain
Hmm.
starts to be shut off gradually. But in the Southern Ocean, it's a little bit different in terms of energy sources, but there's no bounding limits because there's no landmass. There's just
Wow.
this.
Tell me what was your sketch, like, just out of interest, because I'm fascinated about big adventures myself,
Yeah.
and I have still a few that I want to do. But what was your most, well, exciting and maybe also scary moment of that whole trip?
Well, I think I can start with probably I'll start with one of the more surreal moments. So I'm. This is. It's at the very end of. It's at the tail end of a storm, and everything gets very confused, because the wind has been blowing in one direction, usually in the same direction as the swell. So the swell gets heaped up and heaped up and
Mhm.
heaped up, and then the wind changes direction very suddenly. And in the Southern Ocean, that happens within 10 minutes. It's blowing 50 knots, say, northwesterly, and then within 10 minutes it's blowing 75 southwesterly. So the ocean becomes chaotic.
Oh,
So
wow.
it was
It goes
after
in
one
all
of
the,
these.
like the swell goes in one direction and the wind blows in the other, and it becomes like,
Well,
it's,
so the typical swell in the Southern Ocean is 10 meters, and that's, it's a very big wave, but the wavelength is very long, and that gets amplified. So what you have is a 10-meter amplified swell running in one direction,
oh,
and you
yeah.
have winds that are generated at that place at that moment by the wind, and those are 6 to 8 meters.
And
So
that's on a good day, it sounds like.
no, that's a bad day.
Or that's a bad day. Oh,
That's a bad day. On,
yeah.
on on a good day, you have this generally well aligned swell, swell that's not been typically amplified by some massive storm, and
Yeah.
it's not anyway. So you have this very chaotic sea, this large
Uh-huh.
swell, large wind wave, and of course it's blowing like hell.
And you decide to get in there because you're avoiding an even worse.
Well, I can't avoid it. Like I've done everything in my power not to be in that place, but I
You
can't
end up.
I can't outrun the weather in the boat that I was in. So I just you just get pasted. There's just no going around it. So I was at the end of this very bad storm, and I was out in the cockpit. I was out on the back of the boat, trying to understand how I could keep the boat going safely given the conditions. So I'm trying to adapt right to the conditions. So, and a huge gust comes along, and that makes the boat want to round up into the wind. So the boat suddenly wants to change direction, and at the same time, a wave picked me up and then broke right on top of the boat. So what happens is the boat kind of starts to broach, which starts to slide sideways. At the same time, it gets lifted up and then thrown down, and so it gets lifted up and thrown down basically, and it happens in a heartbeat. You don't even have time to think about it. You realize, oh my God, here comes this big gust. You can hear it coming. It's like a freight train. Literally, it's like a freight train coming because the wind is it's just unreal, and you can see it in the water. The water is just turned to foam and nothing but mist. So you have this wall of white coming at you, which is the gust front, and that it's you kind of hope and pray that it's not going to be too bad. So the gust comes and just wipes the boat out, and at the same moment I get hit by this wave. So this is kind of this
Oh,
this
perfect storm.
perfect storm, and not am I just hit by the wave, because the wave will suddenly just make you go faster, but the wave breaks, and the wave, when it breaks, is enough to just flip the boat.
Yeah.
So in a heartbeat, I'm now swimming up like this. I'm swimming, what was horizontal, right, is now vertical. So I realize I'm swimming up the side of the cockpit to hang on to something. The boat is almost completely underwater. And I realize as I'm swimming up, I'm thinking to myself, I hope the mast comes back, because typically what happens when the boat does that, when it gets pulled up, the mast is gone or is broken, and
Yeah.
so the
Then
mast.
you,
As I'm swimming up, I'm thinking, oh, I hope the mast comes. I hope the mast is. I hope, and then the boat just flips, it gets thrown down, and then the wave, just the way the boat is designed, it comes up relatively quickly, along with the way that the wave dynamics also help it right itself, depending how you are in the wave, which was fortunate for me. I ended up in a place where the water helped bring the boat back up. So I'm mostly upside down, and then it's swimming, and then suddenly almost right side up again. In the time frame, this is all happening in relatively slow motion, and I'm thinking, I hope the mast comes up. And then I look over to my left, and I see the mast. I go, okay, that wasn't so bad. And then the next thing is, I hope the cabin isn't flooded. I hope all the water that's supposed to be, like, that's your only job. My only job is to keep the water on that side, the outside of the hull, right? It stays there and I stay here. So I think I hope the boat's not flooded, because then I have nothing but 4 months or 6 months of misery, right? Because I'm barely halfway around now. I'm actually not even halfway around when that first one happened. Because if the boat's filled up with water, then it'll never dry. Most of the food is gone, all that sort of stuff. So, but I was unbelievably lucky. So that would be one of the more surreal moments.
This podcast is brought to you by the Garden of Your Dreams Masterclass. Are you struggling with finding the right tools and tricks for your garden? Are you lacking the confidence to be a self-sufficient gardener? Do you sometimes get overwhelmed by the lack of knowledge? and time you have to actually do gardening, then the Garden of Your Dreams Masterclass is for you.
I want to tie it now back to the work that you're doing as an oceanographic. I'm having a hard time saying though. Can you help me out again with how you say it?
I'm an oceanographer, formally
oceanographer.
an oceanographer. Yeah, not a photographer, but an oceanographer.
That helps. Oceanographer. Yeah. So you always wanted to be that, even though the maybe the universe decided differently that you had to help people to be found online.
Yeah. No, that
was still your big passion. So you tied that to that trip, and you did some research.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about being a citizen scientist. So I went to some of my old contacts in the academic world and said, hey, I'm planning this trip. I would like to do this. I know that, for example, there was a scientist who was on my PhD committee who was part and parcel of this program to just throw current drogues in the world. So they were basically this team of scientists led by this guy. The guy's name is Thompson. Was to just throw drifters on the surface of the ocean. The drifters were all GPS tracked. So the issue in science, even today, is that it's really, really hard and expensive to get good data. You have all these great ideas, have all these wonderful theories, but the theories themselves cannot be proven until you get data, real world, real good data.
And is that then also part of understand, like we talked about the holistic complex organism, that's part of the science to understand how that works, or is it more to see what climate effects have?
No, it's to understand all the different. It's to understand more deeply some of the features that seem to be the most relevant. So obviously, currents are incredibly relevant to the way that heat is transported around the world, right? And the idea and ocean atmospheric coupling is the most important. It's just about the most important thing in terms of climate change, because what drives a storm at sea? What drives a hurricane? It's the heat. The ocean is the largest repository of carbon dioxide in the world, like bar none, clearly, right? It's also the largest heat capacitor. There's more heat stored in the ocean than there is anywhere else in the world. Yeah. So there's these incredible drivers of just about everything that we know about the natural and don't know about the natural world. Yeah. So currents, of course, is obvious. Like the reason that Northern Europe is warmer than Northern Canada is because of the Gulf Stream. It's because you have heat that's transported north and eventually east.
Yeah, I got to realize this year that Toronto, New York, which gets you can get blizzards and extreme colds. It's actually on the same latitude of the south of France.
Yes.
So Belgium, where I'm, it's more northern. And even Scandinavia, well, there it does get a lot colder, but let's pick Belgium, it's higher than most cities in Canada. But because of the Gulf Stream, we have very mild winters. Yes. Some talks are saying, and I'd love to hear your opinion, that Gulf Stream could actually stop in the next, some say even really in the next decade, which would then mean somewhat of a small ice age in Europe. I don't know how much that is possible. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the Gulf Stream turning off would be basically the Earth would have to stop turning, which is unlikely, because the reason that the Gulf Stream exists is because the Earth spins on its axis. So to stop the Gulf Stream, you'd actually have to. It's the Coriolis force that drives everything, in the northern hemisphere to the right, which is why.
So even though some people are claiming that with climate change the Gulf Stream might change or stop or something, it's not even plausible.
It could very well change. There's no doubt that, because it's changing all the time, right?
Oh yeah. Obviously. Yeah.
So the fact of it stopping is I think is a little bit far fetched, because the driver is literally the Earth spinning. So, but it can certainly change.
The temperature changes can have a significant impact on northern Europe.
Course. So, one of the reasons why Toronto and New York are so cold is because winds tend to in where we are at this latitude, winds tend to be westerly, right? So the winds blow from the west to the east. So the wind is blowing across all of the North American continent at that same latitude, and it ends up in Toronto and New York. Well, in the winter, the land mass is very cold because land gets cold and the ocean stays warm because the ocean is this incredibly vast heat reservoir. But those same westerly winds blow across the North Atlantic, and the ocean is warmer, and they land up, in Belgium, and that happens. You have all this instead of the wind blowing the same wind, instead of the wind blowing over a cold land mass, you have the wind blowing over a warm oceanic mass. Therefore,
Yes.
the temperature where you are is warmer. So there's all kinds of there's all these
Wow. It has
there's
a
all these
huge
amazing.
impact because then if you go to like Berlin in winter, it's not it's still like a quite a bit of a drive, but there it's already more continental climate
Yes,
and it
yeah.
gets way colder.
And then think if you go that same latitude all the way across to Vladivostok, the ocean is frozen, right? The ocean is frozen now in at this time of year, or soon will be in Vladivostok,
Wow.
because that same wind is blowing across,
The continent.
this massive landmass, and the land is cold. And this idea of the land cooling off every day is why you get these, diurnal winds. It's why you get onshore and offshore breezes, right? Because the ocean typically, stays the same temperature, and the land temperature is going up and down, during the day and the evening. So there's
Yeah.
like we've talked about, there's more than one driver, right? There's more than one thing there's the guy behind the
there's-
curtain is pushing more than one button, right? The wizard
So
of Oz.
that part of your trip was mapping that out and
Well,
placing these buoys
Yes.
or
Yeah.
what?
So what I went to my friend and said, "Hey, I'm going to be in places where you would never get one of these current rogues. I'm willing to put them in places that would be really interesting to give you some other insight, because, like I said, you need data, and they don't have data in these places. There's no data in the Southern Ocean, right? Because no one goes there except for people.
Except you, who and one of the 9 crazy people.
Yeah, there's very few people that go there, and of course you can use satellites to get data, but again, that's an inference, right? You're inferring, what the temperature might be, or you're inferring, based on your remote sensing, as opposed to guys being there. My dad, like, some of the most important bits, some of the most practical aspects of citizen scientists revolved around oceanic transportation again, because in the old days, they still do it now. Ship's officers are required to record temperature, wind, relative humidity, cloud cover, and they report that. Ships at sea report that globally into scientific databases, and that's the real world data that drives climate modeling. They use that real world data to give
Wow.
real
To
input.
to predict hurricanes,
Yes.
different weather pattern models.
So,
Wow.
if you have a model, right? Everyone knows this idea in the computer age: garbage in, garbage out, right?
Yeah.
So you have a model. That's the black box. You got to feed the model something, and let's just assume that the model is actually good. The people who wrote the code is accurate, and the approximations are good. Well, if the raw data that you're sticking in makes no sense whatsoever, it doesn't matter how good the model is. You're only going to get nonsensical data out. So in terms of weather forecasting, the short-term weather forecasting locally is very, very good, and that's because the data inputs are very good. Like, there's every airport, every news station, there's weather sensing data on top of every building, and that's so that they can put real data into these sophisticated models.
Even though I have a feeling I might be wrong, just maybe because I got aware of it, that the weather predictions are becoming less predictable. Like, sometimes they're wrong. Is that because of climate change, or like that we don't know certain things yet?
No, I think that you're right. The weather predictions are only good for, say, 3 to 5 days. After that, it's just a guess. And that's because we don't know all the inputs into the model. We only know
And the
a few,
variables.
right?
Yeah.
So, and even those aren't very good, because what you have, let's say you look at the surface of the Earth, and you divide it up into squares, and you want to make sure that the weather forecast in each of those squares is good. Well, the only way for that to happen is for you to have really good data in each of the squares, so the model inputs in each square are very good.
It's interesting that you also bring that up, because my father, who's obviously a farmer, he doesn't listen too much to the local weather forecasting.
Yes.
He found a website from a Danish,
Yeah.
I don't know the name, I could find it, and he swears by that one. The models are way more correct.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's interesting that, and
So
even
that's
farmers have a lot of knowledge about. My grandfather would be on his farm, be like, "Oh, now we can hear the clocks from that church from the next village. It's gonna rain in 5 days." And
Yeah.
he had all this weather prediction not it's because the wind was coming from a different direction
Yeah.
than they could predict. So
There's a really good example, right? So there's somebody who has a really good model. Which is to say that he's been living there and farming outside, living out in the weather. In his brain, he's been building this model, and he knows when one of the inputs is really good, and that really good input leads to a really good forecast, right? So he hears the clock chiming, 2 miles away because the wind is from a different direction. Not only that, but for the sound to travel, the air density has to be different, right? So maybe it's colder or warmer, or maybe its relative humidity is a little bit. But he knows he's managed to sort of formulate this in his mind through years and years of experience. He gets this one really good input, and that's enough to drive a really good output. So that's exactly what's missing in the world. We don't have all these really good inputs, and in most places of the world, this grid I talked about is empty. In the Southern Ocean, there's no landmass. There's very few ships down there. The only ships that are there consistently are the illegal or commercial fleets fishing illegally. 80% of the commercial catch in the world, fish catch, is illegal. So think about that for a minute if you want to talk about ocean sustainability.
And they're not so.
And they don't want anyone.
They don't want to help anybody with.
No, they don't want anyone to know that they're there.
Illegal.
So here's a cool example. Thinking of that to digress. You talk about something really cool. So there was a young scientist who figured out that this is an issue, obviously illegal commercial fishing, and there's no way to tell because
80% of it. 80% of the fish.
Yes, 80% of the commercial fish catch is illegal. And most of the commercial fish catch is consumed by a handful of nations. So most of that biomass that's being yanked out of the ocean is going somewhere else. And they keep working up the food chain. So anyway, and one of the effects is that the albatross population is going down. It's collapsing. And they live in the Southern Ocean, and that's because their food source is
fish.
It's being literally raped. So this guy figured, okay, well, how can we find these ships and then because they're not self-reporting. So he strapped a magnetometer, which is something that measures the Earth's magnetic field, and a GPS onto captured albatross. So albatross, they spend almost their entire life at sea. They fly thousands and thousands and thousands of miles. So as soon as an albatross and they're attracted to ships because the ships tend to throw over food, like fish bits.
Wow.
And they're different. So an albatross, and anything that's different, will attract their attention because that's one of the ways that you stay alive, right? You notice that something is different in your landscape, whether it's a cow grazing or a buffalo or a berry bush. But anyway, it turns out that with a magnetometer, they would fly over a ship. And of course, the Earth's magnetic field is changed ever so slightly by a giant iron mass, right? And then the GPS would tell this guy where it is.
That's amazing. So these ships that are taking away the seagulls or the albatross are kind of, I don't know, paying back is maybe not the right way of saying it, but they're solving that illegal fishing problem.
So he did it on a shoestring, right? Because magnetometers and GPS are cost nothing. All he had to do was go to sea and capture albatross, which is maybe not so hard. So he found they captured 160 or so albatross. They flew the equivalent of 45 million square miles in the Southern Ocean, and they found hundreds of these. Well, I shouldn't say hundreds, but they found dozens of these illegal ships that were fishing illegally. Because if they fly, the only reason for that ship to be there, if it's a military ship or if it's a civilian ship, like a cruise ship or something, a freighter, then they will self-report on AIS. And if they're not self-reporting them, then they shouldn't be there, which means that they're likely fishing illegally. So the albatross would fly over a ship, the magnetometer would go off, the GPS would ping, the scientist sitting at his desk somewhere would go, oh, there's a ship there, and he would look on the because there's websites where all these ships all the AIS data is output, and it's at that place, at that time, there's no ship listed on the AIS database real time, therefore that ship is likely fishing illegally. Wow. So then they would be able to push resources to these very specific places where they knew these ships were fishing. So there's a way to adapt. There's a way to engage in something literally on a shoestring where you can make an impact.
That's an incredible story, like how simple you can. I came across that, and I'm trying to apply it in my work. Like most solutions can be very simple.
Hmm.
And if you
Well,
have different options to solve an issue, always take the most simple one, even if it feels so simple
well,
that it's like too good to be true.
it's
Still
Occam's
go for
razor.
that one because it's
It's Occam's razor, right? Which is
yeah,
and the other thing too is that a very smart person can explain a very complicated concept very simply. Yes,
yeah,
E equals mc squared. Like it's everyone knows what it's the simplest thing in the whole world. Energy and mass are the same, but it took Einstein to formulate that. A very someone who's maybe not so smart will take a very simple situation and make it sound unbelievably complicated.
hmm
So I'm completely on your side when you say, okay, simple. Let's think simple. Can we do this easier? There's got to be a better way. There has to be a simpler way that we can, that we can have at least the same, that we can have at least the same affect
result or yeah,
on the
sorry.
problem. And it's the way that it's the way that nature works. Nature is not looking for complicated solutions because they don't work in the long run.
hmm
This organism that you talked about is simply constantly striving for the simplest possible solution. It's an invasive species, right? What's simpler for Mother Nature to evolve a completely new species, a completely new tree, or just to move one tree to from one place to the next?
hmm
So Sitka spruce, for example, is speaking of invasive trees, Sitka spruce is one of the most commercially viable tree species here on the West Coast. It's been here for thousands of years, but it's an invasive species. It started in Northern California. And as climate changed, it's been migrating north, and eventually down the eventually into the Aleutian chain.
hmm
But it didn't start out here. It landed here somehow, some way. So this part of the citizen scientist stuff I did was tree coring, going to sailing to crazy places where you could only get a boat. With students I got on, I went to UBC and said, hey, I'm going to go to this crazy place, and is there somebody who's doing anything interesting out there? And the forestry people said, well, we have this student who's doing genetic studies on the migration of Sitka spruce, north and west. Can they get on board the boat, and will you take them to a place that we could never go? I said, sure, we can do that. So there's this. So there, I don't know anything about. I don't know anything about trees, but I was able to help, right? And I was able, and it's a relatively.
I think that's a beautiful, and that's the point that I wanted to make by interviewing you today as well. Is that okay? With your day-to-day job, you can have an impact.
Mhm.
I would say your impact in helping our planet is rather indirect.
Mhm.
Like if you can help me to reach more people, that will help. Like,
Correct.
but then whatever your passion is, maybe there's a way that your biggest passion, which I think clearly for you, it's sailing and adventurous trips. I'm assuming it is that correct?
Well, I think I liked. Well, I guess I don't want to sound this. I don't want to sound this to be arrogant. It's going to come out arrogant. I just like to help.
Yeah.
I like to help.
I don't think it's arrogant.
Better. I like to serve. I think we have it. I think we have all of society is built on this idea of duty and service.
Yep.
You as a father, you live to serve your family. I'm a father. As a soldier, you live to serve your country. I was a soldier. As a scientist, you live to serve culture and knowledge, right? As an entrepreneur, you live to serve in your community. So this idea of service is I think is fundamental. It's not just important. The foundation of our society lays at the feet of duty and service.
Yes. So that's it. And I thank you for correcting me. So the driving force in your life is being at service with then the combined passion about the oceans and adventures like you've done. But then the point I wanted to make is that maybe there's a leisure activity that you have and that you're passionate about that you can turn into something that helps the environment. Just like you're helping scientists across the world with your crazy adventure where nobody wants to go into those oceans. You're the one that can bring hugely important data to the table. And there's other similar things that I've seen now, projects popping up that people get together, of course, to plant trees. There's a ton of things you can do. They're building projects, like all of this stuff. I think it can be hugely beneficial to the holistic approach of solving this problem that we are facing. But okay, how can we sustain living on this planet, or actually thrive living on this planet? I think that's a better way of putting it. So
let me say, so you like to surf, right?
yes, I love it.
Okay, you like to surf. So you could, as a surfer, every time you went to the beach, estimate wave height, right?
Yes.
And you'd get very good at that after a while. Well, why is that important?
Well, period.
And then you could come up. There's all kinds of ways to define a wave. Well, that's important because waves that are hitting the beach, they transport soils from one place to the other. It's called littoral transport, which is an incredibly important bit of science to understand, right? Because how soils get transported, down the coastline from one beach to the other, I can guarantee you that there are people who've dedicated their whole life to understanding littoral transport, and then understanding how that impacts, soil conditions, how that impacts nearshore oceanic viability in terms of the marine biomass, how that impacts migration of larger marine mammals, because I'm thinking of the oceanic larger marine mammals, because of course if you have this stuff being transported up and down the coast, that means nutrients are going up and down the coast, which means that whales who are traveling north and south or east and west, they have to eat, so they're relying on these nutrient transports or the presence of nutrients in order for them to survive. And so this idea, you could literally just go to every time you go surfing, so you hook
pretty
up
much anything you do in life, you can add something.
So your passion for surfing, you can find someone has some idea of why that's important. My example was littoral transport, like soil transport, down the beach, up or down the beach, and you could give him data that he or she would not normally get, and that would be incredibly valuable to how they, to the work that they may be doing. So it's this little tiny piece of the knowledge puzzle that they're trying to fill in. That's what science says. I'm not going to solve everything, but maybe I can, get a little small glimpse into this. And it could be, there are people who are interested in clouds, right? Who simply go outside, look every day, and describe what the clouds are like, which is incredibly important. It's one of the easiest ways to predict weather locally, is to understand what's going on.
And it's probably very meditative as well.
So you might just go there and meditate outside, and you could actually say, I'm gonna just learn a little bit about. You could actually just get a chart from these guys and just tick off,
Are you aware, and maybe that's a business idea for you, but are you aware of a platform that actually brings these scientists together with other people that are like surfers or sailors like you? Is there a system, a platform?
Sure, I think there's I don't know them off the top of my head, but I know that if you just Googled citizen scientists or Googling a bit, you would find it. I know there are people sailing now, who are trying to engage, trying to engage scientists with their passion. So you could simply, if you want to be more proactive, you could simply I simply wrote a letter to the physical oceanographers in my field when I was going to sail around the world. And the other thing I did was I did micro and I did macro plastic surveys, looking out on the ocean and trying to count bits of plastic in places where nobody goes, right? So I would dedicate a certain amount of time every day if I could to get outside and look for it, right? Because this idea of plastic in the ocean is a problem that's not really going away, because anyway, and I tried to do some microplastic surveys, and I just couldn't do the required science because it's too difficult. But my point is that there isn't anything that you have that someone has a passion about that you can't plug into the scientific community if you're so inclined. So I think it's, as humans, I think we have a duty to serve. I've mentioned that, and you can contribute in ways. You can contribute locally to the global knowledge base, right? That helps move us forward, helps keeps us, on this planet, help become, better and more informed stewards of this place that we call home. I think that's important. I just don't think it's important. I think it's vital.
I agree, and I think I might be repeating myself in some of the episodes, but I often talk about the ripple effect that has, both on like a visual or like, let's say, a physical way, that, I don't know, whenever you walk the streets, you pick up a piece of plastic, and throw it in the trash, it's not going to solve the plastic problem that we're facing. But maybe you'll see somebody else looking at you like, huh, what is he doing? Picking up trash on the street. Maybe that's going to inspire that person to start doing the same, and then it ripples through.
Yeah.
And it gives actually, I try to do that also when I go surfing, when I see it laying around, and it actually gives me a good feeling. It feels like, okay, I'm done, I've at least accomplished something, or I did something good. So there's something to say about that, even if it's small. It seems to be small and insignificant, and then that's also linked to the butterfly effect, like
Yeah.
that a small change can have a huge impact.
Well,
That's what we do with our gardeners. I encourage people to do regenerative gardening, and I don't try them to do it because it's good for the environment. It actually saves them a lot of time and back pain, because that's like we talked about. If you do it in a certain way, it has so many different benefits. One is that you have to work less in your garden. So, but for me, it's important because I know that this type of gardening, it also improves the environment, even the local biodiversity. So yeah, it's incredible to see the work that you're doing and how that links up to having an impact in the world. Seemingly small, but rippling through on many levels.
Yeah, I mean that's the beautiful thing about it, because it would be the height of arrogance and hubris to think that I do this and the ripple effect is going to be that. It's like it would be like literally predicting the future. Like you would have to assume you're some sort of god to think that I can throw this pebble in the water, and this ripple is going to have this reaction. Literally, literally I am predicting the future. It is so absurd on its face.
Yes.
All that matters is that you pick up the piece of trash. That's the pebble you throw in the water.
Yep.
And if it's
The rest is
do you remember I said earlier you have a moral imperative to do good? So you're walking down the street and you see a piece of trash on the ground. What's harder? Is it harder to walk by it, or is it harder to pick it up? Well, clearly it's harder to pick it up, right? So that's the moral imperative. Do the hard thing. The next thing is, well, what do I do with the garbage? You can throw it back down. That would be the easy thing. The next harder thing is to dispose of it properly in some way, shape, or form. So I mentioned this idea of the moral imperative is scale invariant. Literally, and you have no idea what'll happen when you pick up that piece of garbage. You don't bend down and pick it up because you look out of the corner of your eye. There's someone looking at you, right? So you're doing this for reasons that are beyond, the moral good. It's just this narcissistic, I want to virtual signal and look good, right? I'm going to bend down. And as soon as a person turns away, you throw it out again, right? Because you've already done your bit, right? It's a beautiful analogy. I love the way that you say, and this idea that the ripple effect goes forward in time. You have no idea what it's going to be, but you've done something good, so you can only assume something is good is going to come out of it, right? Imagine if you walking down the street, again, this is simplistic, but I think it's might be helpful, again, to illustrate a point. You walk down the street, and in your pocket, you have some trash, whatever it might be. You look down and see a piece of plastic, so you take out of your pocket and you throw that out on top. So it sounds ridiculous, right? But it's the moral imperative is to bend down and pick something up, not to make it worse, right? Not to make it worse by throwing more on it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And imagine someone sees you throw something down. The chances of that person, maybe someone else coming over, hey, what are you doing, is probably pretty good, right? Depending where you're doing that.
Yeah,
because
and I used to live in Munich in Germany, and people seem to have a real big connection and respect for their public environment more than any other city I've been to. So whenever somebody would throw a cigarette butt on the street or even a chewing gum, especially older people would come up to you and say, like, hey, please pick that up. That's not how you do things around here. They're very proud of it's Bavarian, even, like, they're extremely proud of their area. And I think that's beauty, that you can be proud of your environment that you live in, and then you protect it more. And also then a big part of what you're doing is also understanding it, because there's a quote, I think it goes something like, we can only protect what we understand.
Yeah.
So the work that you're doing about the scientist is just about, okay, how does this thing actually work? It's a key to then also be able to protect it or enhance it or have a positive impact on it. And then it's also because we then can see it. That's all of the change that I've seen in my life that has a positive impact. You have to be able to visualize it. Same with my father on our farm. We started to do regenerative practices. My father was like, I don't believe that this is ever going to work. It's like these things, like you think the green nature stuff, it's going to help farming. No, we've been doing this in that way for a long time. That's the way things work. But still, we persisted, me and my brother, to try certain things. So you also did sample plots. We said, okay, half of the field is still the old way, and half of it is the new or the regenerative way. And then we get the results that are mind-blowing. Yields go up, maintenance costs go down, fuel consumption goes down, soil quality goes up. And then my father could clearly see it, that it was actually better for him. Now he's the one who's doing he's buying the seeds to use the cover crops and the regenerative methods. So once you can prove certain things, and that can only be done with certain scientific backup, then it's easier to keep doing it in the good way. Otherwise, you're just guessing at things.
Yeah. I think you make a really good point there, and I don't mean to say this is in an indirect way, but the point that you're making is that if you have a system, and the system is good, you can't just blow that system out just because the system is new. If you're going to replace this, what you replace it with had better be better, which is what your father is saying. Okay, we've been managing to feed an incredible number of people this way.
Yes.
So in order to blow this up, this had better be very good, right? Which is the scientific method between those two. So in order to replace old system, new system had better be better. And the old system it's there because it stood the test of time. That's one of the great equalizers, right? If something has been around for a long time, there's probably something good about it.
Yes.
Industrial
farming actually eradicated world hunger.
Yes, of course.
It's hard to say that because some areas people are still in hunger, but it's mostly related to wars or conflicts or climate change now, of course. But it kind of, in the last 60 years, the industrial chemical complex of farming, which massively increased the yields, eradicated world hunger to a certain extent. But then it came with a price to pay on the environmental impact, and they were not aware of that.
Correct.
And then now we are. So what are we going to do about it?
Yeah. So you just can't blow up the industrial agricultural complex because there's bad things about it. Because if you do that, most of the world's population will starve like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because of yields, just like you said. So if you're going to replace this with that, this had better be good, which is the exact path that you're on. You're saying, okay, we can do this. We can still feed the world, right? And more, but we can do it in a slightly different way. We don't have to blow everything up. We can we can adapt based on what we know and what we can see, because now we know more. We know what the downsides are. Before we didn't know what they were. Now we know what they are. Let's tweak this a little bit. Let's adapt what we're doing to have a more sustainable outcome without actually blowing up this side of the fence. I think that's a wonderful argument wonderful description of this process that you've said, because that's it lies at the heart of what we have to do. It lies at the heart of adaptability. It lies at the heart of how humans have been able to thrive. I mean, if you think about climate change, this is an interesting thought experiment. So humans live across the globe in unbelievably extreme climates because they've been able to adapt. Think of the people, think of the Greenlanders, think of the Inuit living in northern Canada and across, northern Russia. Think of the First Nations people think of the Aboriginals living in Australia. Two wildly different climate extremes, right? Extreme, but without any other intervention other than what they could dream up on their own, with none of the resources that we would think are necessary today. They were able to adapt and thrive, live, love, and thrive in those environments because they were able to adapt. So facing climate extremes, which we will be, don't you think we should be able to adapt? Well, I think the answer to that is yes. And I just have to point to the extremes, right, that already exist to say that, we we should be focusing on adapting, just like you've described about regenerative farming, how that's an adaptation to what we're doing, not a
Yep.
without a complete blowing up of
No,
what we know about agriculture. It's an adaptation.
no, it's building on top of what actually works. It is the scalability of farming, and then going to actually fixing the problems that are part of the old system and replacing them with things that are even better. And that's what farmers are actually, that they have already been doing for 60 years. They've become, like I'm always saying, that farmers are the best businessmen in the world.
Well, they
because
have to be. Yeah,
the
they
ones
have to
that
be.
the ones that are still farming today, I can tell you, they've been through a lot, and they know how to run a business. Because farmers, we might even have a perception of the old MacDonald had a farm, and that does not longer exist.
No,
So
no, it's yeah.
it's so important to stress that farmers, they are mechanics, they are accountants, they are traders, they commodity traders, they do all of that, and it's crazy. So and the ones that are no longer, like the people that are farming today, they went through a lot. A lot of people have quit along the way. So the people that are still doing it today are like really, really good at it. So it can become very arrogant, like politics now telling them that they've been doing things wrong,
yeah.
and that they should change overnight to an ecological way of farming. I mean, there's a good say. It's like I said, it's good to point out to that direction, but then how are we gonna do it and not like eradicate the good things they've created? So yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah, I think the margins are so slim. Like the margins are so slim in farming, and the probability of
Probably same
catastrophe.
with fishing as well. That's why
Yeah.
there's so much illegal fishing.
Yeah, so it's a tremendously difficult problem, right? And it's shocking that we've been able to be good at it. Just look at the number of people fed as a single metric, right? The amount of people who are
Fed
who
every
are
day.
who actually have access to food is shocking. I asked my dad, who grew up in Holland during the war. We were in the grocery store, and I turned to him. It was around Remembrance Day here, so November 11th, and I said, "Dad, what would you have done? What would it be like if somebody, living in Holland, the winter of starvation, 1945, what was it like if they walked into, say, Walmart or something like that, this giant grocery stores?" And he said that people would have been killing themselves outside just to get in. It would have been just mayhem. It would have been crazy. And here where I live on a small island, there's only 4,000 people live on this island. If things got bad, like if things got really bad, the response to a civic emergency is an armed response by the local constabulary in front of the grocery store. So it's not, all they're going to do is get a bunch of guns, park a bunch of cops outside the grocery store, and stop people from killing themselves trying to get in. And that might sound crazy, but look what happened during COVID. That people are rioting over toilet paper.
Riots all over the world.
So this idea of food availability, and we've become just completely nonplussed about it. We just take it for granted that there's going to be this massive amount of food in the grocery store coming from all over the world. I walk into the grocery store and I'm shocked. I still can't get over it because I grew up. My mom, we were growing carrots, right? Carrots and turnips is the only thing that could grow, in a garden back then in Saskatchewan. It's all glacial gravel, basically, right? And clay. There's not much. So without fertilizer, there's stuff that grows. It's interesting. Anyway, so we could grow turnips, we could grow rhubarb, and we could grow carrots. So that's what I grew up on. I grew up on carrots and potatoes. So when I walk into the grocery store, and it's like, I'm shocked. I'm just, what's there? Like, and we just take it for granted. Oh, I'll just get some kiwi fruit, and oh, look at that. There's a wonderful, pepper.
No, there's a big say about food sovereignty, how an own nation can provide for its own citizens to have healthy, affordable food. And that's part of that equation of like, okay, do we need to import all those foods from all across the world? In COVID, a lot of grocery stores were running empty because a lot of areas in the world, they couldn't provide for their own food. So I think that's changing, and local farming and getting like supporting people that are doing regenerative farming is really a big step into that direction. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, Bert, I feel like we can keep talking for hours and hours here, and maybe we should do that at some other time.
Yeah.
But we have to start wrapping up the episode. It's already been more than 1 hour and 38 minutes. It's crazy. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah.
Just to wrap it up, what is your single best piece of advice for our listeners that want to have an impact in the environment and want to do something good in business as well?
Well, I think if you want to have an impact on the environment, firstly, you have to think locally. Like, what am I doing? What am I doing? What am I engaging with? What motivates me to get up and do this, whatever this might be? And someplace, there's a scientist who's completely and totally absorbed in that thing, and you can make a contribution. You can make a significant, meaningful contribution to the global knowledge base by engaging with scientists who are interested in the thing that you like to do. So it could be anything. It could be, we've talked about farming, we've talked about, oceanography, we've talked about trees, we've talked about the beaches. So you can, it doesn't, and the scale doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be grandiose. It's like picking up that little tiny piece of plastic that you walk by. The ripple effect of that is something you can't imagine. The idea you engaging in this is absolutely transformative, not just for you, but for your community and for the scientific community, perhaps as a whole. So I can't, from my perspective, I simply cannot say how meaningful and how important that can become. And in terms of business, and again, this is sort of business encapsulating everything, because we're in the business of living, right? That's just flat out, right? I would say boring is best, which is a way of saying that you have to persist. If you are unwilling to persist, then you will simply be unsuccessful. You were able to persist in showing your father that regenerative farming was the right way to go. But if you had not persisted, if you had quit, then you would be nowhere. You would not have been successful. So you were persisted in the face of everybody saying no, which is typically what happens. You'll hear no way more often than you'll hear yes, and cannot more often than you hear can. But you need to persist, and you need to persist typically at what's very boring. So I'm sure going through the motions, showing your dad doing the same thing, after a while, no matter how exciting it might have been the first time, it gets boring afterwards. So I can assure you that
bureaucracy that we had to go through to do these things, because the legal, like it became nearly illegal to use these kind of seeds that are actually beneficial for the environment. It was crazy paperwork to get it done. Eventually, we found a way.
But
I love that advice, like going through the boringness of things and taking pride in that work and persisting. Like,
boring is best.
How consistent can you be at something that's?
Well, I think that the beautiful part about that, if you're boring is best, which is kind of a interesting way of saying that you have to be completely embedded in the now and divorced from the outcome. Like the future is not in my business. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone, a month or a year from now. The only way that I can get to where I want to go is to understand where I am, which is to say, what is now? And in your case, what is now is I need to find these seeds, right? And so that's now, despite the goals that you might have to transform industrial agriculture worldwide, which is something you could very well do. Right now, you have to find a seed or seeds, and that might be getting up doing the same thing every single day for a month. But unless you solve this problem, then you're going to get nowhere. So, and that might get very boring after a while. So, if you're willing to persist, then you will succeed. Full stop. Oh. You don't have to be good. You don't have to be smart. You don't have to be anything other than persistent.
Well, that's a beautiful piece of advice to end up. I'm really excited that we got to talk about all these things, and ending with that, it's amazing. So, Bert, how can people reach out if there's some adventurous listening or people that want to learn more about even search engine optimization in your work? How can they connect? I'm thinking maybe sailors are listening. Actually, I do have clients that became friends. They'll be doing a big travel, a big world sail tour. I'm going to encourage them to get in touch with you and see if they can actually help with some of the scientific work.
Sure.
So how can people find you, reach out to you?
Well, the simplest way is just Bert terHart.com. So BERT TERHART, BertTerHart.com. And if you Google my name, there'll be all kinds of stuff too. So you can, if you go to berterhart.com, then you can, you can
You find all the other links.
find all the other stuff there. So
And you're most active on LinkedIn, I think, or
sure, yeah, you can get me on LinkedIn too. So again, my name, but I'm really anybody who has the courage to reach out, because that's, again, it's the harder thing to do, right? Is either, well, I could ignore it, or I could actually send an email. Ignoring or sending are the slightly harder thing, is to actually sit down and write the email. So there's a moral imperative to do that, like I talked about. So if people are courageous enough to and do the work to reach out, I'm more than happy to talk and reach out again, because for one, it's an incredible privilege to be able to speak to other people, and I mean this in the most sincere way I can possibly say it, is that it's a blessing and a privilege for me to speak to other people with different perspectives, because that only enriches my own. So there's and I'm incredibly and internally grateful for that. So if anybody's listening, they want to reach out, I'd love to hear from you. Let's put it that way.
Nice. Okay, we'll put all of that in the show notes. Bert, the sailor, the adventurist, the SEO specialist, thank you so much for coming on to the show and bringing all this beautiful knowledge.
Oh, well,
I wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
Yes, well, thank you. It's been my privilege, and dank u wel, meneer.
Dank je, terecht. All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.